Good morning. Thank you for listening to WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville, Kentucky. This is Artist Talk with LVA, the show produced by Louisville Visual Art, and I'm your host, Keith Waits. And with me today is Sarah Battle. Sarah works in the Education Division at the National Gallery of Art and also researches Washington Color School artist Kenneth Victor Young, which is what brought her here today. Sarah has spent much of the last few months on sabbatical to better understand Young's formative years as a painter in Louisville through an oral history project. This project aims to document the mid-century Black art scene in Louisville, Kentucky. The Oral History Project is made possible thanks to the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Kentucky Oral History Commission, and the University of Louisville. And on May 6th, she presented her current research on Washington Color School artist Kenneth Young at the 2022 DC History Conference, organized by the DC History Center and DC Public Library. I don't think I've said DC so many times in one moment. Thank you, Sarah Battle, for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Keith, and thank you so much for having me on the show. It's always a good day when I can talk about art, so I really appreciate it.
Is there a day you don't talk about art?
No, I just have good days.
Well, it's one of the reasons to get into that as a profession and as a field. So I always like to start at the beginning. So why Kenneth Victor Young? What grabs you about him and his importance?
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, I work at the National Gallery of Art. I'm a museum educator normally from 9 to 5. So occasionally I get to pick a work of art in the collection and talk about the work with the general public. And one day I picked an abstract work called Red Dance by Kenneth Victor Young. And I was struck by the fact that there was nothing on the artist. This work was hanging in a room with artists like Sam Gilliam and Alma Thomas, who have volumes of scholarship on them. And Kenneth Victor Young had relatively little. So for 3 years, on my personal time, because I'm a nerd, I started interviewing people that knew him informally and tried to present and write on him as much as possible. And right before the pandemic, February 2020, I was able to go to New York to see a show that I wrote an essay for. And at the opening, two former Louisvillians, is that how you say that?
Yeah.
Okay. Two former Louisvillians, Joyce Tyson and Norman Bush, were there to support their late friend. Kenneth Victor Young died in 2017. I never got to meet him, unfortunately, but they came to the art opening to support him, and they were telling me all these stories about his childhood experiences in Louisville. And it was one of those moments where I had been focusing on so much on inserting his importance in the Washington Color School movement because he's been historically overlooked for so long. And I took a step back and I was like, oh, I never thought about his childhood in Louisville, Kentucky. That's important. And then I started learning more about the artists that he grew up with, like Bob Thompson, Sam Gilliam, Robert Douglas, Fred Bond, musicians, poets that are now nationally acclaimed. They all grew up together. And so, yeah, the pandemic hit. I think a lot of people had cool hobbies. Mine was researching things in the Courier Journal. And I started thinking about how I could document the stories that I was hearing from Joyce and Norman those first couple months during the pandemic. So that kind of led me to apply for a sabbatical and apply for a grant to stay here for several months. Yeah, so that's how I got here.
So Kenneth Young is in what is, I guess, sort of like the second wave on the Washington School, which the first wave is a small number of artists. The second wave is a lot of people. Are they all missing this kind of history, or was it just that you had this thread that you wanted to follow on Young?
Great question. So the category Washington Color School is sort of arbitrary. Don't tell art historians that. But the six painters who kind of were clumped together in 1965, they were exhibited together in a show called Washington Color Painters at the National Museum of Modern Art in DC. It's now defunct. But yeah, so these painters were not creating together. They were not like meeting in a specific bar and talking about abstraction or color theory. They knew of each other, just like Louisville, DC is pretty small, so they would have known each other. But the second generation is kind of after this moment where DC starting to get on the map on a national conversation. And so artists that were doing similar things started becoming affiliated with that movement. And the same is true for Kenneth Victor Young. He was occasionally labeled that in the 60s and 70s, but over time, because of that inconsistent label, he was just removed from that category, and his style changed. And so a lot of other artists in DC, they also deserve more recognition if they're affiliated with that second generation or second wave. But I only have the bandwidth for focusing on one artist.
Sure. Well, I don't mean, I'm just, and again, you had a very personal reaction or relationship with this one particular piece that started you on this journey, and which makes it a very authentic, sort of motivation. So then when you start looking at Louisville and you start finding out all these things, so it seems like you're discovering something special was happening in Louisville, the kind of thing that maybe you only can appreciate over time, like from looking back from a perspective in the future, but looking at the past from the perspective of now. Does that seem to be the right interpretation?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm about halfway done with my oral history project. So I've interviewed about 6 people. And generally, I end the interview with that kind of question, like, what do you think? Why do you think this period between the 1950s and 1970s generated so many and supported so many artists that are now nationally known or nationally recognized, or should be nationally recognized? And some people have very succinct answers about the incredible network of support in the Black artistic community during the civil rights era. Others, they comment on the fact that they didn't know it was a Renaissance at the time, but looking back, they recognize how special it was. And I think that's probably true of any sort of movement or time. You don't realize what's happening until hindsight.
Well, so how much, we ran an event together, an event that really was you and some other people had put together. And there are a lot of other artists that were sort of the next generation from Young that are still around. So you were sort of paying attention to people like Ed Hamilton and William Duffy and Bob Douglas, Emerald Lucille Allen was there. So that, it seems that's a part of it. So is their work, is their career part of the Renaissance, or is that the sort of aftermath of it, the sort of future of it?
Great question. So I chose the time period between 1950s through the 1970s, that 20-30 year gap, because I registered the fact that so Ken Young, before he moved to Washington, D.C. in 1964, he was a art scholar at the University of Louisville in the late 50s. I think he went to school between 58 and 61. And then he worked at the Frame House Art Gallery for a couple of years before he moved to Washington to pursue a career as an exhibition designer at the Smithsonian. After that, it was not apparent until my sabbatical, but now that I've been able to see more archival material, I noticed that he came back to Louisville several times to show his work. His big breakthrough in DC did not really happen until 68, when he got a gallery representative in DC. So between 1964 and 1968, he came back to Louisville and he showed at an collective called the Louisville Art Workshop. So the Louisville Art Workshop is, some people in Louisville know it, but beyond Louisville, it's not well known at all. But this workshop was something that came out of an informal collective called the Gallery Enterprises. And the Gallery Enterprises were made up of University of Louisville students, like Robert Douglas, Robert Carter, who were at the event. as well as Kenneth Victor Young, Sam Gilliam, Bob Thompson. When they were students, there was not many spaces that would allow African-American artists to show. And so they created their own at Joe's Palm Room, Brown Derby, Top Hat, bars that would let them show their art, critique their art, also have moments where they poets could come and share their work, or the theater community could put on something. This is the time of beat poetry, bebop, like a lot of creativity. And so a lot of the bar owners deserve a lot of credit for hosting them. So the gallery enterprises sort of dismantled once people from that collective, half of them, maybe less, but significant artists like Kenneth Victor Young, Sam Gilliam, Bob Thompson, they all left Louisville. And so when they left, there was a couple years where, and I'm still figuring this out with Robert Douglas and folks who were part of this transition. There were a couple years where spaces like the Frame House Art Gallery showed their work. The Speed Museum, they hosted an annual Art Center gala where they had students or anyone that applied for it could be shown once a year. And then around 1968, the Louisville Art Workshop formed by Fred Bond, G.C. Cox. Can't believe we've gone now maybe 10 minutes without saying his name. That's embarrassing. I'd love to spotlight him. G.C. Cox.
There's a lot of names to say.
Yeah. Yeah, but he's considered the Dean of African American Art in Louisville. He is someone that mentored so many of these artists that I've already mentioned, but also was sort of a peer. He came into art late into his career. And they started to form the Louisville Art Workshop. And this workshop offered art classes. They offered space for artists to come and meet and just talk, as well as exhibit. And so during that time when Kenneth Victor Young was creating his signature style, he's well known for these floating orbs. And his transition to the style was significantly supported through these exhibitions here in Louisville. And this is part of the story that I didn't know until literally 6 months ago, when I started to have time to go through the archive and talk to people informally before my more formal oral history interviews. And so the workshop was, this is what inspired William Duffy to join. At Hamilton, they joined this collective. Ed Hamilton became the director at one point in the 70s. And so I wanted to make sure I captured that moment. But if I had known what I've known now, I would have made my oral history project extend through part of the 80s, because up until this sabbatical, I didn't know that an art collective called the Montage was formed right after the workshop. And that collective was even, I mean, they just built off each other. They learned what worked, what didn't work. But yeah, that was just something I didn't know from outside, from studying in DC. So so much more to learn from.
Well, and what's interesting is that listening you talk about that, and I've heard these things too from talking to people like Duffy. You know, Montage is such a great story, and it got attention in things like the Courier Journal at the time. But you know, that doesn't mean anybody knows anything about it, even 10 years later, much less 30 years later. But and I know we could probably sit down and we could probably identify some Caucasian artists in this period and track these histories, but there's a part of me that feels like, and tell me if you agree or if you think I'm wrong, that because there were things like the Louisville Art Workshop and Montage, that the development of Black artists, because they maybe had to work together, but there was more of an imperative to be a collective. It seems like that history is almost in some ways more documented or codified, maybe not as documented, but that it's sort of codified into these organizations, that one leads to the other, because they had to make their own union.
Yeah, I think it's also important to realize, I mean, Ed Hamilton and William Duffy, they've shared this a couple of times in various, I guess, platforms. They grew up thinking they were one of maybe a few Black artists. And so being welcomed into the Louisville Art Workshop by J.C. Cox and Fred Bond and Robert Douglas, and seeing that there was a whole a collective there waiting to help support them in whatever way was radical. I can't underscore that. Like, there was no other space that they would have been welcomed to exhibit their work. Ed Hamilton shared at the art event a couple of weeks ago that his senior show was up for a week, 4 years of work, and it was only up for a week. And when he figured this out, he had to find ways for others to see his art, so he knew what to do with his life. Yeah, so I think that story needs to be centered, and it is being centered because the impact of these collectives really hasn't been identified and celebrated enough in a national conversation. It's starting to, and it did, I mean, there has been a lot of work, especially in the last 5 years, to celebrate these stories and create space for these conversations. And I want to give a shout out to you, Keith. I think I told you this the first time we met. I think it was like 2018 when I started to research Kenneth Young more broadly about his life. I did obviously know he was from Louisville, and I knew he went to University of Louisville with a couple artists, but I didn't know the extent of his classmates. And I remember learning about Robert Douglas and hearing that he was in a conversation on a radio show, and it was in conjunction with a exhibition curated by Aaron Rosenblum at the Wilson Historical Society. And that conversation that you recorded, that you moderated, was the first time I got to hear stories about J.C. Cox, about Kenneth Victor Young in a context that was wider than what I was doing. And I'm so grateful that you all had, was it William Duffy, Ed Hamilton, and Robert Douglas? Yeah. You had the three key artists from that period talking about their mentor, their peer, and there's nothing written on that moment. I think that also needs to be underscored. Like, the reason why I chose to pursue an oral history project instead of trying to write a book from whatever I was gathering informally is because I wanted to make sure that the stories were coming directly from the artists or the family members or those who contributed to and were supported by the Black artistic community from the 1950s through 70s. Yeah, I cannot underscore the importance of that radio interview, because it was really the first time I was hearing some of these stories, and it still is one of the only resources that you can listen to and really learn about some of the important players of this period.
Well, I appreciate that. And it is something I've become aware of, when I started doing this show. It was, it was always took it seriously, but over time you start to realize that you're recording an interview with people when they have that sort of history and legacy. And there's other people I could think of too, but I could remember the first time I had Ed on the show, and Ed can talk about his life and career, any aspect of it. You just have to, it's just like you just have to select a file, and he just can unload and really go off. And he and Duffy are both wonderful storytellers. And then Bob Douglas is the sort of the academic arbiter of all that. They're a great trio of people to talk to. It also occurs to me that all the things that you're talking about, like the problems that they were all facing about finding spaces to show and finding spaces to work and making their own sort of community. When I talk to and work with young Black artists now, they're facing all the same issues, that it sort of hasn't gotten better, but at the same time, I feel like what's missing is they're not coming together as a collective. They're not forming a montage. And I think that they're, maybe something else is happening. Maybe they're starting to get more places in the larger establishment in Louisville. Hopefully, that's part of what's happening. But I can remember talking to Duffy a few years ago, and I said, "Where are all the Black artists in town?" Because you've taught all these kids, and you've watched all these them grow up and go to college, and like. And his answer was, I think they'll leave because they don't think there's an opportunity here. But we've now discovered that there is a whole nother generation that's sort of rising up. They're mostly very young. But I think people like Lanai Roberts and Shawntrese Martin, who were both at the event the other night, and lots of other people, Jalen Stewart, Victor Sweat's not so young, but he was actually sitting in the interview. He was sitting literally at their feet that day when we did that interview. But so is your research giving you any sort of insight or understanding about what's going on with the younger community of Black artists in Louisville today?
I wish I could speak more about that, but I have been primarily researching and looking at material from the period for my oral history. I have tried to go to a couple art shows during my time here because contemporary art is my jam, so to speak. But stepping back a little, before I came to Louisville, I did not know what I would find down here. When you are researching Kenneth Victor Young and looking through files in DC, there are two places, the Archives of American Art and the curatorial file at the National Gallery of Art. The curatorial file, as well as one at GW that now has the Corcoran Gallery, which was dismantled a couple of years ago. So there's a couple of files, but it's really a handful. And he is becoming more well-known. The other artists in Louisville that deserve national recognition and haven't, I was worried I would not have a lot of material to look at. The first day I went to the University of Louisville's art library, I literally got weepy because they had a full conference room, all these files on artists, on the artists that were Height art scholars. And they also had works of art that they had collected over the years by these artists. That is not well known, and it's also pretty incredible. I put on that art event at Joe's Palm Room so that people from outside of Louisville that grew up in Louisville but no longer live there, like Robert Carter and Joyce, who I had initially got the impetus of the oral history project from, they wanted to come down and see their friends. And so I put that together so that they would have a space to do that. But then I also had the artists go to University of Louisville and see the work that they were in the collection of. They didn't know that. They themselves did not know what works were in the collection. The Filson also has a tremendous amount of material that one can look through pertaining to this period. But more importantly, and something that I am so grateful that I have had 3 months to kind of sit here and respond to what I'm seeing, is the fact that so many family historians have saved things. You mentioned Ed being able to talk about any part of his life. That's because he is a Lowkey Hoarder. He has saved everything. And I'm so, so happy and grateful that he has, because he had the vision to know that his stuff was important and that somebody was going to need it, telling his story moving forward. The same is true for Duffy. His wife, Sherry, she has boxes of things, and she has created scrapbooks with captions. And again, could get weepy with that, because sometimes you're looking at a photo and you're like, well, that looks like Duffy when he was 30, but she has the exact place, time, all this information that is an archivist's dream. And the same is true for Miss Lucille. I mean, if you are at any art event with Miss Lucille, she's taking photos, she's documenting the moment, because she knows how important it is to be able to say, you were there, this happened, because of these stories are, as you mentioned, I mean, the Courier Journal did such a great job of documenting this period in the 50s through the 70s and even in the 80s. Sarah Langsdale, she wrote such vivid descriptions, and as well as Diana, and I'm going to blank on her last name.
Diana Heilemann.
Yes, those two women, I mean, I'm so grateful for the fact that they were writing for the Courier, because they were there, they were highlighting these artists. But aside from the Courier and the couple of institutions, it's the family archives that really matter. Dr. Douglas, he has works by a variety of his friends hanging in his walls, and he has a story for each and every one. It's been kind of mind-blowing to think that this material has been here the whole time, and I was one of the first art professionals to come to their homes and sit there and listen and sit there and look through all this material. It's very humbling, and I'm so grateful, but it's also a little sad and disturbing, because they knew this whole time that they were important enough to keep this material, and I'm so grateful for that. But I'm just hopeful that by this oral history project can generate more awareness to their legacies and to their collectives, because they contributed so much to the American art history period.
Well, the only thing I would dispute about you is that Ed is a Lowkey hoarder. I think he's not. I think he's much higher ranked than Lowkey.
I think he would agree.
Yeah,
his daughter definitely would agree.
That he can actually create like large scale sculptures in that space is pretty remarkable. But again, that's manna from heaven for somebody like you, right?
Oh, yeah. It is so cool that he has saved his high school sketchbook. He has a sketchbook where you see him drawing and his teacher is writing remarks. And there's one towards the end of the sketchbook that's the teacher, who he credits for really encouraging him to pursue art in a more professional setting. Mm-hmm. She wrote painting. That was her comment. And he has painted that work. He did, and he saved it. It was shown. This is a crazy Louisville moment. I've dubbed the phrase Louisville moment when things seem way too eerily circular. But this is a little bit past my oral history period, but the montage, that group, there was a member named Anna Huddleston.
Right.
And she was the art resource coordinator for all of the public school system. And when she met Ed, who I'm not quite sure how they met, you might know more about this since I'm just learning about the montage, but she had found that painting in the school system's storage unit from the show that he had put on as a senior. And when she joined the montage, she was able to give him that painting. That is a Louisville moment.
Yeah, I get it. I get what you're saying. Anna Huddleston is another one of those people that I know about her because I know people who worked with her and who were greatly influenced by her. A very important figure in particularly the education circles. But if you just Google, we allow ourselves to imagine that it's all out there, and you Google her name and you just find absolutely nothing. I think maybe what comes up is that one montage photograph. There's a group photograph of them that was in the Courier Journal, and I think she's in that. And of course, as you say, it's all in boxes. It's somewhere, but it's not readily accessible to the general public to be able to flesh out these kind of things.
I'll also just point out that the collectives during this period, they were the two significant ones in the 50s and 70s for visual artists were spearheaded by a person named Fred Bond. Mm-hmm. Fred Bond and Anna Bond. Their impact on the Louisville modern art scene, they've just been so undervalued in conversations around this. And it's also because Fred moved out a couple times and came back. So I just want to highlight Fred's legacy just for a second here, because he is someone that I've not been able to access boxes and boxes of. I've only learned about his legacy through conversations,
Right.
or through like seeing his name on things. But he helped with the gallery enterprises, and the gallery enterprises also helped create the first couple of years of the St. James Art Fair. After some people had left Louisville, he helped form the Louisville Art Workshop. And once that was set up, he then got a job at the Fisk University's Art Gallery, and he was a curator there. And this is really cool because I recently found out through Fisk Archives in Nashville that he helped curate a show honoring G.C. Cox. I had, up until this point, never known G.C. exhibited at Fisk. But Fisk University had a show highlighting 4 abstract styles of his, which is so important because now I know what his art looks like when. Since there's not a lot of stuff written down, and since there's not a database that tells me how many works of art GC had made between 1960 and 1970, I have to learn as I'm going. And so seeing this material and seeing that Fred had helped his friend, I assume, land this incredible opportunity. And then a year later, Kenneth Victor Young gets his solo show there. I mean, that sort of network and that sort of support, it starts to extend outside of Louisville. And so Fred came back and then moved to Cincinnati, and he started the Cincinnati Art Consortium. And this space was very similar to the Louisville Art Workshop, where it offered classes, it offered exhibits. He died pretty young, so maybe that's why his legacy has not been more recognized. But his dream, and Ed says this a couple of times in his interview, like his dream was to make sure that his peers had gotten recognition. And he so did not understand why that no one was really paying attention to them in the 70s when he was creating these spaces outside of Louisville and in Louisville. So I like to think that I'm helping in some small way to spotlight his legacy and the work that he started.
I was also thinking about the timing of your project. You've specified that your motivation for it predates the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic is like, I don't know, I think for those of us living through this time, it's going to be sort of like BC. It's going to be, there's the before the pandemic and after the pandemic. But because the pandemic in Louisville and many cities, and I guess the nation as a whole, you know, also comes along at a time of this sort of racial reckoning and protests and the rise of Black Lives Matter. And of course, Louisville was one of the, you know, unfortunately, one of the hot spots for that because of the murder of Breonna Taylor. And you know, and I've heard a lot of people saying conversations, you know, like if you can find a silver lining, a positive impact to that sort of event, it is that it pushed a lot of conversations. It pushed a lot of, you know, issues to a level that they were, you know, instead of being ignored, you had to confront them. And of course, we all know that with time, some of them will fade back into the background. But were you thinking about all that as you came to Louisville in this period? How aware were you of that? And how do you see your project sort of becoming a part of that new awareness?
Yes. So I'll answer that by also taking a step back and sharing that. So I started talking to Joyce and Norman in February, a couple of weeks before the pandemic hit. And I was like, maybe I'll go to Louisville for a weekend in May just to see the spaces they were talking about. This is before I knew I needed to document their stories formally.
Mhm.
And then a couple of weeks hit, and the pandemic shut down everything. My flight was canceled. And I mean, that was when I was going to meet Professor Douglas for the first time. And as I started to grapple with the new reality, a lot of museums, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this sort of reckoning that museums had too, but while all of this was going on, a lot of museums rethought their strategic mission, vision, values, and the National Gallery was going through a change already. We got a new director maybe 2 years ago, Kaylin Feldman, shout out to Kaylin. And she was already rethinking all of these things. And so I think my project idea came at a time when people were already rethinking what formats are important, who can apply to what. My sabbatical is through the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. It's a research branch, part of the National Gallery. It's pretty unique. And they have one spot for staff to apply. And up until my application cycle, or maybe the one application cycle before, they had not really opened it up to anyone other than curators or conservators. And so from a museum organizational standpoint, when they opened it up to educators who research, that allowed me to apply to take time off work. Mm-hmm. And I'm so grateful for that sort of timing. If I had this idea any sooner, I wouldn't have been able to take off time and pursue this in a genuinely more intentional way. And the same is true for my grant. I have no doubt the Kentucky Oral History Commission was trying to rectify their past too. And I mean, who knows what they would have seen any sooner than when I had applied for it. But they saw the importance, thankfully, and this allowed me to be able to stay in Louisville for a couple months. My sabbatical at work paid for about a month off, because most people are not trying to do an oral history project. My whole project format is not typical. Most people are writing an essay. So my end product is interviews. And so I knew, coming as an outsider, as a young white woman interviewing mostly people of color who are 70 to 90 years old, who've lived in Louisville all their life, or most of it, I knew I needed to create genuine connections. That was the only way that the interviews were going to be successful. So having the opportunity to stay here for 2 months and simply meet people on their time, wherever they wanted. My schedule was completely free for that. Checking out these archival material that I didn't know existed until being here. I think this sort of foundation is really important. And I created that event a couple of weeks ago that you mentioned, or we've talked about a couple of times, also as a way to say, hey, I'm here. If you have anything you want to show, please come up to me and introduce yourself. I try to make myself as accessible as possible, given the short amount of time I have here. But I have to hope that after pandemic life, institutions will seriously value and understand that there's no going back. There's no letting these stories be forgotten, and that people from the quote unquote outside of Louisville are looking and they are caring about these stories. And I'm just excited to see what's to come.
Well, I am too. I do feel like there is already some evidence of sort of backsliding, but I think it has to do with looking at you got to look at what your programming is at a fundamental level, and not just the performative things, but like the things that nobody's going to know you're doing are really where you start to make changes inside the organization. I was just, but I think about all that because, again, it's like, what we're talking about here is a confluence of things, right? That if you had applied earlier, or if you'd applied later, you might have looked more opportunistic. Like the timing seems just right. And it seems like you've done a really great job. The way that the people we've been talking about through this interview, Ed Hamilton, William Duffy, Sherry Duffy, Emery Lucille, Alan, they seem to have really embraced you. And I mean, of course, they understand your mission and the importance of it, that this attention is going to come. And when it comes, you want to make the most of it. You want to give as much as you can because of the opportunity that seems to be offered there. So let me ask you, where does all this finally result? Does this become something, I mean, it's a project and you will turn things in to appropriate people, but will I be able to read through this? Will I be able to access it and read through it? Will it become a book like that could be out there for the public or something like that?
Yeah, great question. So the interviews will be preserved by University of Louisville, Kenneth Young's alma mater, which is a nice tie-in. They will be transcribed and accessible whenever that is made possible. And I am hoping, here's my little manifesting plug, I'm hoping to create a book. If anyone wants to be my publisher, shout out to publishing folks. I would love to work with the artists to create something that honors their legacies while they're still here, and to tell the story the way they would like it to be told. There are so many ways that this project could help future scholarship. And so I also want to just say that once this oral history project is done, I'm going to try to create awareness for it, because I should not be the only one writing on this period. I should not be the sole whatever contributor to this conversation. That is not the point of an oral history project. That is just to create a primary resource for people to come in with their own questions and see what they find interesting. And so, yeah, these are the goals. And if anyone wants to, work together on an exhibition, I would love to spotlight the artists in that way too. But I do hope that it's just the beginning for the artists to feel that recognition and to feel seen.
Is there hope then that, like, when there is this sort of an academic project and it goes into these archives, that another Sarah Battle is going to come along and go, oh, look at this great piece that was done, and I want to talk about that period too, or I want to do a whole thing on Douglas or Hamilton, or does it sort of breed, like the more that happens, does it breed more work like that?
Oh, 100%. I think that's the trick of the art market and art history. When someone says it's important, then people are like, okay. So by having the University of Louisville backing it up and preserving these interviews, that's one way that someone is saying, yes, I agree that these stories are important. And hopefully maybe a University of Louisville student who's working on a thesis might see this resource and that might interest them. I also want to just pause here and say that I am not the first person to do this. I want to make that very clear. I'm coming from it through a visual art background and my personal background as a museum educator. There has been a student, Wes Cunningham, who also interviewed several artists, but his thesis was more about the intersection of arts and the civil rights. And so that's preserved at the University of Louisville too. My project expands out to focus on musicians, poets, collectors, scholars, in sort of the lens of the network of the Black art scene in Louisville from a specific time period. I also want to say that Ken Clay, he is a historian, entrepreneur, insert any label. I don't think that man has slept ever. He does so much for the Louisville Black art scene here. And he has written a book. He co-authored a book and it is on 2 centuries of Black Louisville history. Highly recommend that resource. It also has a section on the Louisville Workshop and the gallery enterprises and photographs. He has photographs of this important moment. It's about 2 pages, but that is the most on that topic. at all. So there are people that have been putting out information. And lastly, there is the Louisville Modern, which is a book on the Louisville Modern art period, and it highlights some of the artists, not all the artists that I am particularly interested in, but it does create sort of an introduction to the period in which I'm interested in. So definitely not the first, and hopefully not the last to research this.
Well, Sarah, it's this is an almost inexhaustible subject, but we'll bring it to a close, I think, on that note right there. I certainly would like to read, even if it doesn't get published. But we'll talk. I know some local people who might want to publish that book. But thank you. So Sarah Battle from the National Gallery of Art, talking about her project on Kenneth Victor Young, and which sort of did it sort of not steamroller, but what is it when something the stone picks up, it like gathered more momentum, became something maybe a little bit different than you expected. Do you think this is the last do you think you would ever come back to do something else about this period and any of these people, or?
Yeah, this is just the beginning. I found what fulfills me, this project, and there's so many more stories to be told in so many other ways. And yeah, I look forward to the future.
Okay, well, we look forward to talking to you about the more you do.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you.